It's certainly been an interesting day, and I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to contribute my 2 cents to this broader discussion. And I hope to do so by saying something about youth and the younger generation. George Orwell said that every generation imagines itself to be more intelligent than the one that went before it, and wiser than the one that comes after it. Yet a generation inevitably passes the torch to the next one, which will replace it and in turn leave its mark on society. While we talk about the enemies of pluralistic societies today, it is today's youth that represents the hope or the challenge for the pluralistic societies of tomorrow. Now, due to my own interests, I'll try to share a few general remarks and reflections on the problem of youth through the lens of student activism and student protest in the region I'm most acquainted with, that is Eastern Europe, East Central Europe, Southeast Europe. So I'd like to say a few words about that first. These countries, unlike Western Europe, have had the experience of dictatorship and authoritarian rule in the relatively recent past. The parents of today's younger generation still have some first-hand recollection of it. While these countries might be on the periphery of Europe, so to say, historically it is often the periphery where change starts to happen. For this reason, I would certainly not dismiss Eastern Europe in light of the media's focus on the upcoming elections in a number of Western European countries this year. More so, these countries have certainly not been immune to the effects of the crises that have come to engulf Europe in the past decade, and perhaps some of them felt them, or aspects of them, more acutely than other countries in Western Europe. I'm talking here about the economic financial crisis, the refugee crisis, and of course the geopolitical crisis, which is now more or less framed as a new Cold War between the West and Russia. All of these countries have seen significant examples of student protest in the past decade, and the historical traditions and importance of student activism are more often than not dismissed. While throughout European history, students played an important role in movements for national independence and spearheaded revolutionary movements since the early 19th century, the importance of youth and students in reform and radical movements tends to be overlooked because they are often of a transitory nature, though their role is manifested more clearly and most clearly when there was an alliance with a broader social movement. University campuses were centers of revolutionary activity, and students were carriers of modern ideas like liberty, socialism, equality of opportunity, ideas that sometimes were ahead of their time and would only come to the fore later on a more broader societal plane, while student activists could go on to play more significant political roles in later life as adults. This is why student activism also gives us insights into how part of countries' future elites are formed. Leftist traditions were carried by the student movement in Greece after the fall of the dictatorship. We can see, for instance, how Syriza in Greece still fits within that tradition. In post-communist Eastern Europe after '89, former student activists are prominent in the political, cultural, media, and academic spheres. Also, many of the oligarchs in the region rose from the ranks of the official erstwhile youth organizations. To a degree, student activism is also helpful to understand such post-1989 phenomena as the rise of populism in countries like Poland and Hungary. Those of us who have studied student movements in these countries have been perhaps less surprised about the prominence of certain political ideas now apparent in the region. Why? Because we're often dealing with the same people. Ultimately, what I'm trying to say here is that students and their political activity constitutes a social and political barometer, an indicator for social and political change. In the West, we often associate student activism, student protest with the mythical year of 1968. But in Southern Europe, student youth played a very important role in opposing authoritarian rule and bringing down the dictatorships. In 1989, students throughout the Soviet bloc countries had been on the front line of grassroots mobilization of the opposition against the communist regimes in what constituted a truly transnational generational phenomenon. Following the events of 1989, a wave of optimism and enthusiasm swept Europe as Eastern Europe hailed its return to Europe, even though shortly after, Europe saw civil war, violent bloodshed, and genocide return on the territory of former Yugoslavia. In the process, the young students who had helped bring about the changes were forgotten. But then once again in the late 1990s, the young generation rose in protest in the Balkans. It were in fact students who spearheaded the movement that led to the ouster of Slobodan Milosevic. And the 21st century started off on a positive note for Eastern Europe, with EU enlargement, and in other countries like Ukraine, which saw political events like the Orange Revolution in 2004, again with a crucial role for student youth, apparently signaling a trend to come. Now, from today's perspective, these sentiments seem like nostalgic musings about a long-gone era. Why? Well, basically, the crisis, starting more or less in 2008, has swept away this optimism. At present, barely a day goes by, or the media is reporting about the end of Europe, the rise of illiberalism, authoritarianism, and the possibility of a new Cold War. For many commentators, a gloomy time is set upon us. Now, for all the alarmism, policymakers seem to ignore that part of society on which we will need to rely to steer us out of the crisis, namely youth, especially since the crisis has hit the younger generation particularly hard. Now, I'll just like to reflect based on a few country examples. Most countries have seen significant student protests in the past years, and one country has strikingly not seen it, and I'll explain why. Let me first start off with Greece. Now, Greece has a long-standing tradition of student protest. However, ever since the country's debt crisis, exacerbated by the global financial crisis, had led to punishing austerity policies, the younger generation has been hit extremely hard. Protests, often marred by violence, have become a mainstay. Greece's crisis is soon to become a decade-old reality. With a youth unemployment rate of 50%, the situation is dire, with no improvement in sight. Already, before the crisis hit in Greece, the situation of many young people was quite precarious. There was talk about a 700 euro generation, denoting their lower monthly income. Now, there is talk about a 300 euro generation. Greece's youth cannot hope for an improvement of their perspectives in the near future. More so for many young Greeks, students who are now at the university, the hardships of austerity are what they have grown up with and have been socialized in. In 2005, when the Greek crisis was making headline news all over Europe and beyond, a young engineering student commented, "We remember being at the kitchen table and our parents talking about when times were good. But I don't know when we'll experience it ourselves. How do you outrun a crisis?" In the process, the political center's once dominant position among Greek youth has completely collapsed, from more than 2/3 of the vote to barely 1/5. While of course Syriza now can be seen as having moved into the void left by PASOK, more worrying is the rise of the extreme right Golden Dawn. At this point, with Syriza having now also conformed to austerity politics, it is hard to make optimistic predictions about Greece's future, let alone the prospects for its younger generation. The experience of coming of age during these crisis years is bound to reverberate at a later age. Now let me move on to neighboring Bulgaria, which at first sight might seem a bit different. Now 3 years ago, in 2013-2014, a culmination of political turmoil engulfed the country, seeing anti-government protests that lasted for more than 1 year, continuously. These protests were supported by the majority of the younger generation and also saw students occupying universities. However, while the protests were a factor in bringing down the government in 2014, During the elections in 2014, the younger generation was also that part of society that abstained the most from voting. And interestingly enough, we have some sociological research done on that, and it sort of seems to indicate that Bulgarian youth tend to not vote out of protest, so it's just seen as another form of protest. And there are also some polls indicating an interesting trend. Bulgarian youth have very little to no trust in their own political parties and their own domestic institutions. They have quite high trust in European institutions. The answer for this is quite simple. European institutions are seen as much less corrupt. The same year when Bulgarians saw their year-long protest at the end of 2013, protests erupted in Ukraine. It's now often forgotten that it was actually students who started and became the driving force in the first days of Euromaidan. And it was the beating of the students that led to the outbreak of the Revolution of Dignity. But first of all, these students in Ukraine wanted to affirm that they were part of Europe. Now, what does that mean? Polls showed that the single most important issue was visa-free movement to the EU. This is what young Ukrainian students imagined, the possibility to not go through bureaucratic nightmares just to be able to go into neighboring Poland and study a semester or visit friends there. Meanwhile, it is young people who are fighting the war in eastern Ukraine. The confidence in the post-Maidan political establishment has dropped drastically. Young people showed their highest activity in civic engagement in activities that are all related to the war, being either supporting veterans or raising funds. We're at risk to seeing a war generation being created in Ukraine, and I don't think I need to underline the potential problems of having a war generation. And to make matters worse, Europe, the EU, is letting them down, those young people. 3 years after Maidan, Ukrainian youth still cannot travel visa-free to the EU. And as I said, according to polls, this was the most important single issue fueling the protests in late 2013. Just move back to the Balkans, where we have Little Macedonia, perhaps somewhat unknown. And in late 2015, it saw student protests arise, which actually spearheaded the broader protests against the VMRO government, which became the largest anti-government protest since the country's independence. The crisis remains unsolved until today. There have finally been elections, but they still cannot form a government. Now a majority has been formed by the opposition, and the president does not want to grant the mandate. It remains somewhat too soon to see how events will develop further. But what I could say is that when young people in the Balkans and Ukraine, who might have looked to Europe for hope, and see their aspirations turn into disappointment and disillusionment, and this is a potential reality, this could pose a problem in the future. In fact, this scenario is already taking place. It's already happening. And we've already had 2 talks on that country, and it's happening in Poland. Poland is in the news. We've discussed it today. What hasn't been discussed is the other side of the situation, which are the fairly big protests that have been taking place against the current government. And they've been covered quite well in the news as well. But one element of the protest is being overlooked. Barring one exception, the anti-government protests have been strikingly lacking the participation of youth. Now, the one protest where youth did massively participate, this was the black protest and culminating in the women's strike. This is the only protest so far that has led the government in Poland to back down on an issue. I'm just leaving it out there to say if this is correlated or not. During the communist era, Polish students had been quite active politically and played a role in bringing about the demise of the regime in '89. In the quarter century that followed, however, students disappeared from the political scene, seemingly sinking into an apathetic slumber. The only significant youth protests in this period, in the transformation period, were the anti-ACTA protests in 2012 and the sometimes violent demonstrations of nationalist youth. The seeming rise and increasing visibility of far-right youth is a growing problem, as Rafa already explained, though I would, of course, add, in comparison to other countries in the region, Poland does not yet have a far-right or a strong far-right political party represented in parliament. There is some representation, but we're not talking a situation like Jobbik in Hungary. In January of this year, students finally did try to stage a protest of their own against the government. Turnout was low, this has to be admitted, though still hundreds of students did participate, actually making it the largest student protest since the demise of communism. Nevertheless, they were ridiculed from various corners, they were trolled, they were attacked. It seems that people tend to forget that student demonstrations often start with a very small number of students. But nevertheless, it was another symptom showing a general apathy of the younger generation in Poland towards politics. And this apathy has been somewhat of an academic question, usually only drawing the attention of researchers. But back in 2011, the then civic platform, Platforma Obywatelska, led government, issued a comprehensive report on youth. And it presented a rather bleak picture, mainly concerning the social economic realities of young people in the country. But the government chose to ignore it and did not enact measures to improve the situation. And in my opinion, this seems now likely to have contributed in part to the current political conundrum. Recent research on the younger generation in Poland has indeed shown that Polish students feel that the political class does not address their problems. Though they tend to show up at elections and vote, they see anti-establishment parties as representing their interests best, and this has been a trend over the past few years. In fact, this issue points to a broader problem that applies to many of the countries in the region. Youth do not feel that their problems are addressed, nor that they can influence the political process. This feeds apathy and fuels anti-systemic sentiments. The more cohorts of young people who feel this way increase, the more problematic the situation will become in future. Inevitably, today's younger generation will be tomorrow's dominant generation. Ultimately, if we face the crisis today, we need to be able to count on the younger generation to be willing to shoulder the burden of dealing with it. But if the problems that today's youth are coping with are ignored, societies will pay the price. That is the challenge that youth represents, and today's policymakers should do well not to take this challenge lightly. Thank you.